Hello, learners. This is the 32nd lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's novel. I will continue our discussion of Elizabeth Bowen. I ended the previous lecture by giving a little bit of a plot summary and by explaining how The Death of the Heart, published on the eve of World War II, tells a very universal human story, that of the perils of maturation, the impossible and in some ways always destined to be imperfect, and something which always contains the potential for a lifelong tragedy. But essentially, it may very simply be described as the process of growing old. Now, this story, The Difficulties of Growing Old, is made powerful and achieves a singular emotional and textual complexity because these stories are told by a novelist like Elizabeth Bowen, who brings to this story of the process of transition from childhood to adulthood the complexity of the Anglo-Irish relations. Now, I'll talk a little bit about that and how these two things are connected and how these two things are combined in a very powerful and, I think, unprecedented manner in the novels of Elizabeth Bowen. So, the scholar Hermione Lee, who's, I think, very well known today as a biographer, but also as a scholar of life writing, having written biographies of quite a few 20th century women novelists. I think Lee's famous biography is that of Virginia Woolf, and I think later of Penelope Fitzgerald as well. I think among her earliest published writings, Hermione Lee championed the work of Elizabeth Bowen. And I think this book was published in the year 1981, but the details will be on the screen. This book is titled Elizabeth Bowen, An Estimation, and it's part of the Critical Studies series. This was written at a time when there was a complete vacuum as regards to critical appreciations of Elizabeth Bowen in the English-speaking or English-studying academic community. And this book really helped establish Bowen's reputation and, in a way, inaugurated a sort of critical industry and a critical movement, culminating today where one can find a number of articles, books, a lot of research and teaching focused on Elizabeth Bowen. Although it has to be said, it doesn't quite match the kind of output that one sees directed at, say, Virginia Woolf. But I find Hermione Lee's work very useful, and I recommend Hermione Lee's work as very, very informative, helpful, and almost required reading if one is to understand what Elizabeth Bowen is doing and how best to appreciate that. So, in many of my comments on the history, the personal background, and in the critical understanding of Bowen's writing, I will be leaning on Lee's writing. In the introduction to her book, Lee writes that Bowen escaped critical attention early on because scholarly writers failed to notice how Bowen's fiction represented a fusion of two traditions, that of the Anglo-Irish literature and history, and on the other hand, that of a European modernism that was indebted to Flaubert and to Henry James, that is, Gustave Flaubert and Henry James. Bowen's idiosyncratic and somewhat mannered style is a product of this fusion, and it's important to understand the synthesis of an intellectual tradition of realism, which culminates in the style of the modernist novel. That is the tradition from Flaubert and James and to Woolf, this intellectual tradition, but it's inextricably linked to a political tradition, that of the Anglo-Irish history. So, because scholars lacked the ability to synthesize or to see these two strands as in dialogue, Bowen's writing escaped a lot of critical scrutiny in the early years that she was published and read. Hermione Lee's point is that the personal and the emotional, or what appears to be merely personal, and what I described in an earlier lecture as building a very strong sense of mood, right? This emotional concern of Bowen's fiction may be studied as a critique of the English middle classes. Now, this is the first important idea, that of a critique. As a writer who describes human experiences, who describes emotions as universal human experiences, Bowen is also a thinker. Bowen is also a, a very scientific observer of relationships between nations and between communities. I believe it was the scholar Bruno Latour who described a good realist novel as an equivalent of scientific laboratory. And the idea is that just like in a laboratory, a scientist can perform different experiments. A scientist can combine different chemicals and see what results they produce. In a similar way, a realist novel, I think very powerfully, even today, the definition holds, can be studied or can be thought of as an intellectual or a social equivalent of a thought experiment. And what is the experiment that we find in Bowen's novels? The experiment that we find in Bowen's novels is the exploration of the extent to which the universal experience of childhood, with all of its anxieties, with all of its pressures, with all of its tragedies, and with all of its joys as well, with all of its promises, on the whole, the experience of childhood. To what extent can the experience of childhood, if understood correctly, and not just understood as a theory, but really felt, really acknowledged as something that shapes all of our lives and continues to shape all of our lives, to what extent can an understanding of childhood as fundamentally formative of human life, can that understanding yield an adequate perceptive and ethical understanding of the Anglo-Irish community? Now, this is a very big intellectual claim, and novelists don't really work like intellectuals. Novelists don't describe their ideas in the form of a thesis or present arguments like lawyers in the court. I mentioned the thought experiment, and in some ways, one can see Bowen's fiction as a series of thought experiments. Thought experiments in which a lot of descriptions of childhood is described, a lot of vulnerable female young children, their experiences are described, the vulnerability of childhood, the vulnerability of femininity, the vulnerability of lacking parents, the vulnerability of orphans. In a way, Portia is the epitome of vulnerability. A 16-year-old girl, an orphan, living at the sufferance of wealthy relatives and cousins. What can be more vulnerable than Portia? In a way, that vulnerability can be treated or can be understood if seen in the larger picture of Bowen's oeuvre as a fiction writer. That vulnerability can be understood as being deployed as a way to pose and understand a question, which is, what are these people doing? Or what became of these people? And when I say these people, I mean the Anglo-Irish ascendant Protestant community. But to continue with the background, there's a lot in Bowen's novels that is reminiscent of other writers who wrote novels of manners. Manners refers to social conventions, the way people talk, the way people relate to each other, the way things like courtship, marriage are conducted, the way things like property is owned, bought, sold, inherited, etc. So, propriety or conventions, it's very much linked to property, but it's also a bit detached from property. In a way, I think the Marxist definition of propriety is a sort of veneer or a sort of illusion or a disguise that's painted on top of naked or brazen greed for property. But a somewhat softer, also more realistic definition of propriety is the sort of negotiations and the sort of discourses and the sort of languages and rituals that have evolved around this push and pull, around this negotiation for property, for financial wealth. One good example, and I think the best and most powerful example of a novelist of manners is Jane Austen, in whose novels relationships between human beings are described as a very elaborately designed set of rituals designed to hide but also address the very undeniable social reality of the time, which is that in order to survive, women needed to marry a wealthy person. And in some ways, the Marxian reading of Jane Austen's novels would be that flirtation or romance or courtship is designed to be both exposed as a ploy for negotiating for property, but it is also described very, very empathetically as a realistic way of engaging with the social reality. So, love was not just a patriarchal construct designed to ensure that property remained with the men. Rather, love was also a form of, or rather, when I use the word love, I mean all of the discourses, all of the languages, all of the rituals, all of the cultures, all of that taken together can also be described as a way that a lot of women engaged with these social realities. So, the novel of manners was a very, very powerful and very well established convention in English literary history. And Elizabeth Bowen's novels, when they described the politics or the dynamics between four or five people inside a British middle class family, the tradition that is invoked is this tradition of the novel of manners. Within this tradition, there were writers who used this tradition to very powerfully critique pre war illusions, pre war optimisms as quite hypocritical. And I mentioned Howard's End, and that is exactly what E.M. Forster does. The families and the kind of anxieties that are produced in Howard's End, they describe the thin ice on which these few middle class English families were skating. Now, one great strength of Bowen's novels is that they can be easily studied as novels of manners. But that doesn't really explain the power of Bowen's novels. On one hand, the humor that we find in Bowen's novels is very much the humor of these novels of manners. Bowen sees through the hypocrisies and the fine china, the cutlery, the dressing for dinner, and to use a somewhat very, very casual and very, very popular cultural reference, this part is the Downton Abbey aesthetic of Elizabeth Bowen's novels. But then there's also something else going on, and the Downton Abbey aesthetic or the critique can only explain about 50% of what's going on in the Elizabeth Bowen's novels. There's something in Elizabeth Bowen's novels which is quite dark, and this is a kind of darkness which the comedy of the novel of manners cannot really adequately capture. This darkness has to do with some of the realities of modernity. This has to do with an understanding of displacement. This has to do with an understanding of how dislocation, unease, and betrayal, these were not exceptional or tragic events. Rather, these were everyday realities. Displacement and dislocation directly emerge from Bowen's personal life, her own upbringing. As a child of the ascendant Anglo-Irish Protestant community who lived in England for the majority of her life and who built a career as a novelist in London, but who remained attached to that life of prestige, pride, and in some ways delusions of grandeur. Delusions of grandeur because the grandeur remained only an idea. The community to which Bowen belonged, that community had been struggling. And the struggle is crystallized in the fate of the ancestral home, which is called Bowen's Court, which Elizabeth Bowen inherited from her parents and which she could not actually hold on to, even though she managed to undertake some repairs. And quite famously, I find this to be an incredibly powerful detail. And the source for this is the Irish novelist John Banville's introduction to the Everyman's Classics edition of Elizabeth Bowen's short stories. And I think Banville also published a version of this as an essay in the New York Review of Books. But the detail that Banville shares in this essay is that Bowen tried her best to hold on to own this ancestral family home, a really big house, a really big piece of property, actually. But the irony and the tragedy is that even though it seemed to connote a great deal of prestige and a great deal of respect, the reality was that it was a loss-making entity. And so much so that it was more expensive and it was harder for Bowen to hold on to it than it was to let go of it. And the detail is that this house, which is called Bowen's Court, and which was built in the year 1770, it was a huge mansion, 3 stories, and in a way built on land which was given to Henry I, was a courtier in King Henry or Oliver Cromwell's time, and in the 18th century. And this reminder of the family's prestige actually was in such a horrible and dilapidated condition that even though the 20th century had arrived, Bowen's Court did not actually have functioning bathrooms. And it was after the success that Elizabeth Bowen managed to get with her novels being published and being successful that she was able to install 2 bathrooms in the house. Nonetheless, she could not keep owning it, and I think in the year 1959 or 1960, she ended up selling it off. She had hoped that the person who bought it would preserve it, and in fact, that was a comforting thought. In fact, it was what sealed the deal and helped justify the purchase. But the buyer simply wanted the wood and the land and had no intention of keeping the house. The house was promptly razed to the ground. And the demolition of this house is not something that Bowen presents as a great tragedy. In fact, the line that Bowen uses is that Bowen's Court did not live to be a ruin. And there is some satisfaction in that. And it's that combination of elegy, but also a sense of closure, a sense of satisfaction in seeing the house being razed. It's that combination of sadness and closure, sadness and containment, being disconsolate, being in mourning, but also being satisfied within that space of mourning. It's this combination that can be found in the moods that are created in all of Bowen's novels. And in fact, one can say that it is the structure of feeling. It is the structure of feeling that shapes Bowen's fictional world. And it's a structure because it comes from a very clinical and very scientific awareness of the material place that the Anglo-Irish community had. The scientific and clinical awareness was that this was a community who occupied a somewhat wrongful place in the history and the geography of modern Ireland. It was wrongful because it was built on the violence and the exploitation of a vast majority of other people. This other people were the rural Irish Catholic communities. And the Anglo-Irish community had gotten a great deal of privilege and power very early on, beginning with the 18th century grant of land. However, throughout the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, the dynamics were changing. There was a growing movement for home rule for Ireland to be independent. And that independence meant the shaking off of the shackles of a Protestant, Anglophone, English political rule, and the freedom to embrace and to truly be decided by one's own communities, and that was Catholic Ireland. Throughout this process of the rise of Irish nationalism, and this is a tension that defines the work of several Anglo-Irish writers, whether it's Yeats, Shaw, Wilde, or Joyce. But Bowen occupies a somewhat conservative position, in some ways not very likable position. In fact, Bowen is quite disliked by many for her deep conservatism. I actually happen to find that this conservatism is actually what creates the emotionally compelling moods and the characters that one finds in her novels. So, what is conservative about Bowen's position in this England Ireland question? We'll talk a little bit about that. But essentially, the conservatism consists of Bowen's strong affinity towards a system of values. And it's this paradox. On one hand, Bowen understands that it was unfair. Why should a small group of Anglo Irish people own all the land, get all of these very influential government positions? And why should the Catholic Irish community remain underprivileged? It wasn't fair, and anybody could see it. Bowen could see it as well. But this awareness of the unfairness coexisted very powerfully with a sense of nostalgia and a sense of the fundamental and formative nature of that privilege. So ultimately, we can say that Bowen's fictional work is an attempt to reconcile herself to a very complicated notion of privilege. And in some ways, this is a relationship or this is a struggle, an emotional as well as a writerly struggle that is true for a lot of writers. And in some ways, this struggle to reconcile herself through her fictional characters with the privileges that she knows to be unfair, but which also she cannot deny have shaped her as a human being. It's that struggle and the way that struggle is carried out through the descriptions of characters in her novels that makes Bowen's work extremely compelling, at least for me. And I think for anyone who understands this history and then tries to experience the powerful moods that are created in her novels. So, a lot of scholars have noticed that Bowen's novels have a lot of contradiction. And this also begins with Hermione Lee's work, who notices this contradiction between theatrical bravado and alienation, between the pride of property and the sense of deracination, and the final contradiction between self-pity and self-parody. I'll read out a couple of quotes from this memoir, which is titled Bowen's Court, a book which Bowen composed during World War II, during the London Blitz. So effectively, this was something that Bowen wrote after she had written The Death of the Heart. But it's actually very useful to understand the emotional frame which shapes a lot of Bowen's writing. Here is what Bowen writes about the analogy between Anglo-Irish people and children. The existences of Anglo-Irish people, like those of only children, are singular, independent, and secretive. Further, again quoting Bowen, to most of the rest of the world, we are semi-strangers, for whom existence has something of the trance-like quality of a spectacle. So, I'll unpack the first sentence at some length. I find it to be an extremely ingenious analogy to compare the existence of a socio-cultural, geographically identifiable, and ethnic community to a biological category, that of only children. In some ways, this is an extremely presumptuous statement, and in some ways, it reflects a great deal of privilege. The writer thinks of comparing her community to that of only children. But on the other hand, this also tells us that all of the descriptions of lonely children, all of the descriptions of orphans that we find in Bowen's novels, they're not simply to be read as biological or universal, but they're also to be understood as the function of a political and cultural history. Bowen also describes this community as semi strangers. And both of these comments help situate the structure of feeling that shapes Bowen's novels. I'll continue with this discussion in the next lecture. Thank you.